Hello, everyone, and welcome. It's Sunday night, September 17th, 2023. I welcome you here tonight and thank you for joining me. Just by way of report, I just got off of a tour yesterday. We toured the Salt Lake Valley yesterday. We had several things that went kind of awry, but we had a great time, and they were wonderful people. So patient, so kind. You never want to go on a tour in the city of Salt Lake in the middle of a University of Utah football game. Doesn't matter what else you plan around that. And we hadn't anticipated that, but we still had a great time. And I give thanks to all those that were there and for their patience. This next week as well, I'll be going on a tour with a group to St. George. It'll be a 3-day tour. There's still room on the tour if you would like to come, but we're going down to St. George. We're going to the St. George Temple Open House, and then we're going to come back up through Highway 89 and through the Sandpit and talk about the people and the settlements of the Sandpit. So it's going to be a great week. Just a thought for you. I believe that there are moments in all of our lives when we all need inspiration. We all understand respiration. We do it all day. We breathe. Okay? To inspire is to breathe new life into someone else. It is to help someone overcome discouragement or despair, get up, and find the strength to keep going and try again. That is why I tell stories. Stories inspire me. Stories move me. The new book, When Faith Endures, is out now. It's a collection of 52 inspiring stories intended to lift, to edify, to give strength and courage. It's available now at glenrowsonstories.com. And why did I write it? So that you could share it. So tonight, I ask for your prayers. I had an interesting experience today. I was attending sacrament meeting, and comments were made about September 17th is a very significant day. Why? And it got me to thinking. Today is Constitution Day. September 17th, 1787. What would that be? 236 years ago today, the Constitution of the United States was signed. Now, what does that mean? Well, today it means very little to many. It means everything to me. So tonight, in honor of Constitution Day, and I realize that there's a lot of you that are listening from Scotland, the Philippines, other places around the world. And even though I'll be talking about the United States Constitution, I'll be talking about something much larger, and that is agency and freedom. So hopefully there's something in here for you that is not necessarily tied to United States history. So let me speak for a moment of a moment in American history that proved to be monumental, a moment of courage that changed all of our lives and indeed changed the world. May 1787. The United States were free, but barely. They were in crisis. They were deeply in debt. Driven by pride and greed, the states of the American Union fought amongst themselves and refused to cooperate. Moreover, as a United States, we were a laughingstock abroad. In debt and virtually paralyzed, our treaties were ignored, our ships pirated and seized. There were those just waiting for the great American experiment to implode, and they would then gloatingly step in and monarchy would once more bear sway in America. There were even those within our borders who yearned for the return of king and parliament. Hence, a convention was called in Philadelphia in May of 1787 for the purpose of revising America's Constitution of the day. It was the Articles of Confederation. The problem was largely this. You see, today we say the United States is. But then they said the United States are. Think about that. In 1787, we were a very loose confederation of independent states bound by a league of friendship, which was quickly unraveling. So, some 74 delegates were appointed to attend this grand convention. Their instructions and ostensible purpose was to revise the Articles of Confederation, to tweak the existing system, as it were, to solve the problems of the day. But it couldn't work. The system and organization of the Articles of Confederation were flawed on the face and could not address the exigencies of the day. And there were some who were wise enough to see it just wouldn't work. Tuesday, May 29th, 1787, Governor Edmund Randolph took the floor of Independence Hall in Philadelphia and opened the main business of the convention. He enumerated the problems of America that had brought them there, and then proceeded to the remedy, the basis of which he said, quote, must be the Republican principle, end of quote. He then presented the Virginia plan for a new system of government. The first resolution said that the Articles of Confederation ought to be corrected and enlarged. However, so bold and revolutionary were the resolutions and changes that followed in the Virginia plan that the delegates quickly realized they were not revising the Articles of Confederation, they were abolishing them altogether. Notwithstanding the will of the people and their aversion to a strong central government, notwithstanding the instructions given by their leaders back home in their respective states, and notwithstanding the uncertainty of uncharted waters, quote, it was resolved that a national government ought to be established consisting of a supreme legislative, executive, and judiciary. And the resolution carried. Oh, that moment. And the business of the convention went on without a blink. Those men would form a totally new system of government, unheard of in the day, but one that would grow to become America's greatest export. Now, I've thought of that moment. What if those delegates had been more concerned with what the people thought of them than of the plight of their nation? What if they were too timid to think outside the box? What if they cared more of their personal wealth than just and holy principles? What if they had just flat been cowards to the cause and didn't dare take the leap? How much different our lives would have been because they went forward. The Constitution of the United States came into existence because they dared to try something new. We are a free people. Now, next story. I've never learned how to type. Not really. I was in my 40s before I even had to do so. And trust me, trying to learn how to type when you're close to 50 years old, well, that's a wee bit of a struggle. Your fingers are not trained, and I couldn't get mine to go where they were supposed to go. Even now, after all the education and schooling, I still managed to come up with some spellings that would make Mark Twain proud. While doing graduate work in constitutional studies, I found myself frequently having to spell out the United States of America. I don't know why, but as often as not, my fingers would not fly right, and I would misspell it. And it was always the same word, and it was always the same wacky spelling. The word united, U-N-I-T-E-D, came out all the time as U-N-T-I-E-D. Well, one day while composing something relating to the Constitution, I misspelled united again. And the irony of what I had done suddenly struck me. I wrote, quote, "If ever the United States become the untied states, it will be because they are no longer united." The more I thought about it, the more profound and deliberate my mistake seemed. Indeed, it was Abraham Lincoln who said, quote, "At what point shall we expect the approach of danger? By what means shall we fortify against it? Shall we expect some transatlantic military giant to step the ocean and crush us at a blow? Never. All the armies of Europe, Asia, and Africa combined, with all the treasure of the earth, our own excepted, in their military chest, with a Bonaparte for a commander, could not by force take a drink from the Ohio or make a track on the Blue Ridge in a trial of 1,000 years. At what point, then, is the approach of danger to be expected? I answer, if it ever reach us, Lincoln said, it must spring up amongst us. It cannot come from abroad. If destruction be our lot, we must ourselves be its author and finisher. As a nation of free men, we must live through all time or die by suicide." End of quote. I believe this is true. I believe that a house divided against itself cannot stand. If you would permit, may I share some thoughts about one of the great principles of the United States Constitution: unity. Monday, September 10th, 1787. The delegates to the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia were all but finished drafting the Constitution. It had been a long summer, and finally they recommended their final resolutions to a committee called by them the Committee of Style and Arrangement. So, meaning they finished their rough draft. They gave it to the Committee of Style and Arrangement, and 2 days later, September 12th, the committee returned their final report. It is interesting what appeared in that final draft that had not been in the raw draft, at least not in this form. Now, there seems to be no discussion upon it. It was approved as it stood with no debate, and that's unusual. That clause, virtually the last one added, would forever be the first one read with the Constitution. There was the preamble. The preamble to the Constitution reads thus: "We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, to establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution of the United States." End quote. Now compare that, which you're familiar with what had been written in the draft just previous. The raw draft said, quote, "We, the people of the states of New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Providence Plantations, Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia, do ordain and establish the following Constitution for the government of ourselves and our posterity." End of quote. Do you see the difference? Do you see that last moment change? Instead of being a nation of the people of 14 distinct sovereignties, the founders were proposing that we were to be one people and one nation under God. Moreover, the paramount priority and purpose of the Constitution, as they so stated it, was in order to form a more perfect union. What does the preamble do to the Constitution? It is veritably the lens through which the document must be viewed. It is the overarching and undergirding structure on which the entire document rests. The Constitution declares unequivocally the authority, or the preamble declares unequivocally the authority of the Constitution and mandates forevermore how it must be interpreted. The Constitution is to bring unity, defend, protect all of us as a nation and a people. Every law, every action, every judicial decision, if it is constitutional, it is to serve those purposes announced in the preamble, and foremost among all those purposes of the Constitution, union, unity. And it didn't end there. On August 31st, 1787, Colonel Mason of Virginia had declared that he would sooner chop off his right hand than put it to the Constitution as it now stands. Why? Because it didn't have a Bill of Rights. After the presentation of the finished product on September 12th, all the delegates, including Colonel Mason, were given the opportunity to have their views heard. When the final vote was taken on Saturday, September 15th, the majority voted against Colonel Mason's objections. Then, September 17th, 1787, the last day of the convention, Colonel Mason was joined in his opposition to the document, the finished work of the Constitution, by Edmund Randolph, the one who had started the work in the first place, and also Elbridge Gerry of Massachusetts. All three men had threatened not to sign the document if they didn't get their way. That morning, having spent the weekend worrying about this very thing, Dr. Franklin rose with a speech in his hand, and among other things, he said to his fellow delegates, quote, "I confess that there are several parts of this Constitution which I do not at present approve. But I'm not sure I shall never approve them, for having lived long, I've experienced many instances of being obliged by better information or fuller consideration to change opinions, even on important subjects which I once thought right, but found later to be otherwise. It is therefore that the older I grow, the more apt I am to doubt my own judgment and to pay more respect to the judgment of others. In these sentiments," Franklin continued, "I agree to this Constitution, with all its faults, if there are such. When you assemble a number of men to have the advantage of their joint wisdom, you inevitably assemble with those men all their prejudices, their passions, their errors of opinion, their local interests, and their selfish views. From such an assembly can a perfect production be expected? It therefore astonishes me to find this system," meaning the Constitution, "approaching so near to perfection as it does. Thus, I consent to this Constitution because I expect no better, and because I am not sure that it is not the best. The opinions I have had of its errors I sacrifice to the public good." End of quote. Franklin then closed with this plea aimed at the naysayers, Mason, Randolph, Gerry. "I hope, therefore, that for our own sakes, as a part of the people, and for the sake of posterity, we shall act heartily and unanimously in recommending this Constitution." End of quote. Franklin then moved that the Constitution be signed by the members. But it was not to be. Randolph, Mason, and Gerry refused to sign. And when the document went out to the states for ratification, these three joined with others and became a formidable force in opposing the Constitution. It became exactly what Alexander Hamilton had predicted on the last day of the convention. A few characters of consequence, by opposing or even refusing to sign the Constitution, might do infinite mischief. And indeed they did. In the end, after a tremendous battle, the Constitution was signed and ratified. But those three have ever borne the stigma of their stand against the document. How much better it would have been if they had doubted less their own political judgment and wisdom and gone along with that of their fellows. How much better things may have gone if they'd given their names to the document, so that a unified, steadfast front might have been presented to the people. And then, after ratification, worked through the means established to effect the corrections they desired, which came anyway and in spite of them. The foremost principle in the Constitution is unity in liberty. We are to be, should be, ought to be, and my prayer is we will be, the United States of America, not the untied states of America. We are one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. And it is not out there, my dear friends, that a more perfect union begins. It is here, this very moment, in what we say and in what we do. The Constitution was designed to make all men neighbors and every nation friends. I close with these words from the Constitutional Convention dated July 5th, 1787, from Gouverneur Morris of Pennsylvania. This country, he said, must be united. If persuasion does not unite it, the sword will. End of quote. Now, one little parenthetical insertion into this story. The following remarks were caught and recorded by James Madison September 17th, 1787, on that last day of the convention when they signed it. He recorded, quote, "Whilst the last members," meaning the delegates to the convention, "whilst the last members were signing it," the Constitution, Dr. Franklin, looking towards the president's chair, at the back of which a rising sun happened to be painted, observed to a few members near him that painters had found it difficult to distinguish in their art a rising from a setting sun. "I have," said he, often in the course of the session and the vicissitudes of my hopes and fears as to its issue, looked at that behind the president without being able to tell whether it was a rising or setting sun. But now, at length, I have the happiness to know that it is a rising and not a setting sun." Whoops, just a second. Here we go. The point to all of that being, my dear friends, it is right and it is natural and mortal to have differences of opinion on political principles, social issues. We see things differently based on our life's experience, and we form our opinions based on the way we live and love and what we live and love. We can't all see the same thing the same way. That just isn't going to happen in a mortal fallen world. It isn't that we disagree on the issues. It's how we disagree. Next story. Francis Marion was born on the family plantation in Berkeley County, South Carolina, in 1732. It was said of Francis, quote, "Although as a child he was extremely delicate, he grew strong after his 12th year. In his mature years he was short and slight in frame, but strong and hardy in constitution. At the age of 15, Francis Marion went to sea but was subsequently shipwrecked and spent a week drifting at sea in a lifeboat. Following that ordeal, he returned home to manage the family estate. Shortly before his 25th birthday in 1759, Francis Marion joined the British Army for service in the French and Indian War. He fought against the Cherokee and learned of their ways in battle. Then, June 1775, he enlisted in the cause of the American Revolution, fighting for the Americans, and he quickly worked his way up through the ranks. With the defeat of regular army forces by the British in South Carolina, Marion organized a small force of 20 to 70 men, armed and supplied them, and began to engage in guerrilla attacks against British and Tory forces. After one grueling chase, when the ruthless British officer, Bannister Tarleton, had chased Marion and his men for 7 hours through 26 miles of rough country before disappearing into a swamp, Tarleton is reported to have said, quote, "The devil himself could not catch this damned old fox," end of quote. The comment was reportedly caught up by the locals, and Marion became known then and in history as the Swamp Fox. One Smithsonian writer later said of Marion as a fighter, quote, "Because the British never knew where Marion was or where he might strike, they had to divide their forces, weakening them by needling the enemy and inspiring patriotism among the locals. Marion helped make South Carolina an inhospitable place for the British. Marion and his followers played the role of David to the British Goliath," end of quote. Francis Marion proved himself invaluable to the American Revolution. History would remember him as the Washington of the South, a man of ruthless determination, yet humane in character, motivated by what his peers called the purest patriotism. There is one moment in the life of Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox, that should be remembered. In 1781, Marion and his men lived in the swamps and lived off the land to survive. According to a soldier named Samuel Weaver, a British officer came into Marion's camp to discuss the exchange of prisoners. After negotiations, Marion invited the officer to stay and partake of breakfast, whereupon Marion served up sweet potatoes out of the fire, wiped the ashes off with a dirty handkerchief, and placed them on a pine log, which was all the provision they had, end of quote. According to the popularized telling of the moment, the British officer said, "Is this all you have for dinner?" "This is all," answered General Marion, "and we thought ourselves fortunate in having more potatoes than usual when we had a visitor to dine with us," end of quote. "You must have good pay to make up for such a living," said the officer. "On the contrary," answered Marion, "I have never received $1, nor has one of my men," end of quote. What on earth are you fighting for, then? Marion's answer: for the love of liberty, end of quote. It is reported that the British officer returned and resigned his commission, refusing to fight against such men, quote, "who ate roots cooked in a fire and drank nothing but water from the swamp," end of quote. Now, there may be parts of that story somewhat romanticized, as history often does. However, the story itself is based in sworn fact. Sufficient credence was given to that story, as I just told you, that the scene was later captured by an artist who knew General Francis Marion, and that painting now hangs in the United States Capitol building. I share this story with you to illustrate a principle and ask this question: out of the purest patriotism, what sacrifices are we willing to make to save our American Republic and the God-given gift of freedom? Next story will seem unrelated, but it's not. There are two powers battling for control of this world. They are the forces of good and of evil, of God and of Lucifer. We may have differing opinions, but be careful whose champion those principles are that you espouse. As God has those on earth representing his principles, so too does Lucifer has his. This story is about two opposite champions, Moroni and Amalickiah. It was the 19th year of the reign of the judges when a group of men led by Amalickiah rose to prominence. Their desire was the overthrow of free government, the establishment of a monarchy, and the destruction of the church of God among the Nephites. Amalickiah was a large and strong man, a consummate politician, promising all manner of perks and power to those who took up his cause. Moreover, he was a skilled and cunning orator and most persuasive, so much so that those who followed him also left the church for their political opinions. Because of Amalickiah and his politics, the Nephites found themselves in circumstances exceedingly precarious and dangerous. Moroni, on the other hand, was a strong and a mighty man of perfect understanding and sound judgment. He saw through Amalickiah's smokescreen of lies and promises and understood what was really in his heart and what was really at stake among the Nephites. Angry with Amalickiah, Moroni took his coat and tore it to create a flag or a banner, if you will, and he wrote upon it, "In memory of our God, our religion and freedom, our peace, our wives and children." And then he fastened that upon a pole and then strapped on his armor as though going into battle, for surely he was. He then knelt to pray, asking for the blessings of God upon his brethren. And Moroni went forth, raising that symbolic banner, the title of liberty, for all to see. He cried the cause of freedom, rights, and liberty throughout the land, and the people came running to his standard, vouching and covenanting as they ran. So many joined Moroni that Amalickiah and his followers were outnumbered and intimidated. They ran, but Moroni and his armies headed them and brought them back. Amalickiah, however, escaped, joined the forces of the Lamanites, where he would prove an incalculable source of evil and human misery for years to come. Please consider how opposite these two heads of state were. While Amalickiah sought the power of government to destroy the church of God and the foundations of liberty among his people, Moroni had sworn with an oath to defend his people, his rights, and his country and religion, even to the loss of his own blood. Amalickiah was a man of cunning device, a man of flattering words. His intent was to lead away the hearts of many people to do wickedly. Moroni, too, was a powerful speaker, but he persuaded his people to obey God, keep the commandments, and to covenant and keep those covenants with God. Amalickiah did not care for the blood of his people. They were expendable to his ends. Moroni's heart, on the other hand, did glory in preserving his people. Amalickiah stirred his people up to anger, teaching hate and contention. Moroni, on the other hand, taught his people to be faithful in keeping the commandments of God and never to give an offense, and to fight in love for their family and for their friends and their freedom and their children. While Amalickiah's passion was the power to bring men into bondage, Moroni did joy in the liberty and freedom of his brethren from bondage and slavery. Amalickiah was Antichrist. He tried to destroy the church and the cause of Christians. Amalickiah would die an ignominious death on the beach at Bountiful at the end of Teancum's lance. And of Moroni, he is remembered for all time thus, quote, "If all men had been and were and ever would be like unto Moroni, behold, the very powers of hell would have been shaken forever. End of quote. Why was this one tiny moment in Nephite history in a small part of the Americas captured in so much detail and illustrated so vividly to so many by Almighty God? Answer: that we be not deceived again by such men as Amalickiah. The character and principles of Moroni are the standard by which all persons in power should be judged, and judged politicians must be, should be, for our very survival. Next story. If you would permit me, may I continue by sharing some thoughts with you in regards to America, her Constitution, her founders, and her freedom. And this is for those who are wondering, were our beginnings inspired? Is our Constitution of God? Was our founding a part of the divine plan, or just a political expediency and an accident at the moment? In 1788, George Washington said this in reference to the Constitution, quote, "It appears to me then little short of a miracle that the delegates from so many different states should unite in forming a system of national government so little liable to well-founded objections." Do you see that? Washington called the Constitution a miracle. He would be the first, perhaps, to call our Constitution a miracle from God. When the Constitutional Convention was called, there were 3.5 million people in the newly independent, radically divided Americans. As a country, we were weak and vulnerable, and in the middle of a depression. Inflation ran rampant, the national treasury was non-existent, and the currencies of the time were nearly worthless. Our trade deficit was staggering. Congress was a laughingstock among the nations of the earth. Conditions may begin to sound familiar. There was so much bickering and disunity among the colonists, and that's when the Constitutional Convention was proposed and promoted by James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and soon George Washington. And as I have already told you, from May 25th to September 17th, 55 delegates labored to create the American Constitution, the first written constitution in modern world history. And of that Constitution, the Englishman Gladstone Scotsman later would say that he would call it the most wonderful work ever struck off at a given time by the brain and purpose of man. The most wonderful work ever struck off by the brain and purpose of man. Of our Constitution, Benjamin Franklin, who was in the convention, said, and I told you this earlier, "Sir, to this Constitution, because I consent, sir, to this Constitution because I expect no better and because I'm not sure that it is not the best." History has proven it was the best. My friends, whatever else you believe, hear this. Our Constitution was inspired of Almighty God. Contrary to what anyone else may say, think, feel, or do, it was inspired of God. It has been our most important export. And with the exception of 6, every country in the world with a one-document constitution has followed the United States model. I agree with President George Albert Smith, who once said, quote, "I am saying to you that to me the Constitution of the United States is just as much from my Heavenly Father as the 10 Commandments." End of quote. Now, what of those men, those that are so often decried now? What of those foreordained men who drafted this great and inspired document? James Madison said of his colleagues, quote, There never was an assembly of men charged with a great and arduous trust who were more pure in their motives or more exclusively or anxiously devoted to the object committed to them." End of quote. It has been observed wisely, quote, "Only for the brief span of one lifetime would America's statesmen and her brightest thinkers be the same men." End of quote. Our future as a nation, we will survive if and only if we serve the God of this land, who is Jesus Christ. Ether 2:12. George Washington himself once said, quote, "Reason and experience both forbid us to expect that national morality can prevail in exclusion of religious principle." Meaning, we will never survive unless we hold to the principles of the Ten Commandments. Moreover, Washington would later say more succinctly, "It is impossible to govern the world without the Bible." Our second president, John Adams, said, and this is so powerful, he said, quote, "We have no government armed with power capable of contending with human passions unbridled by morality and religion." And finally, concerning our future and our freedom, from Samuel Adams, the father of the American Revolution, Adams said, "I thank God that I have lived to see my country independent and free. She may long enjoy her independence and freedom if she will. It depends upon her virtue." Next story. If you'll forgive me now for speaking personally. It was a hallowed and a long anticipated experience to walk about those sites in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, just a couple of years ago, where so many of the events that I have spoken about tonight occurred that led to the birth of our American Republic. Standing in the Pennsylvania State House where independence was declared and where our inspired Constitution was drafted and signed to protect that declaration, standing in that building was personally profound and inspiring. I wasn't sure I'd ever live to see the day that I could see where the most significant events occurred. And throughout that day, I went from place to place, visiting those sites so significant to our history and freedom. I was at one and the same time grateful for all those who have and still do work to keep those memories alive, those places. But I was also a little disappointed. Everywhere I went, in Freedom Square in downtown Pennsylvania, Philadelphia, I saw signs of neglect, cigarette butts and litter all over the grounds, lawns and landscaping worn and needing attention, peeling paint on the buildings of our history, rusting ironwork, and the most disturbing of all, guides who went about telling the tourists stories about Washington, Jefferson, Adams, and the others that lowered them, debunked them, brought them down, and otherwise destroyed their reputation. And not only that, all over downtown Philadelphia in those sacred spots, there were people loitering or sleeping on the benches in Independence Park. Now, some might consider me just a little overly critical. Maybe I am. But there's a reason for my dismay. Those places, Independence Hall, the Liberty Bell, etc., those places represent the origins of our principles. They're where our American freedoms were born. The principles that all men are created equal and are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, the Declaration of Independence. Other principles such as we, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, etc., do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. These words embody holy principles, and holy principles create sacred spaces and holy places. When we stop caring about those principles, we stop maintaining those places where they were born. And if we stop caring about those principles that made us great and mighty as a nation, we will stop being a great and mighty nation. God forbid. I couldn't even get in to the house where Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence, closed to the public. Something about that gives me terrible despair. A goodly number of the buildings there in Philadelphia, I couldn't get in. And when I did try to get into Independence Hall, I got yelled at by a park ranger over a triviality. God forbid that the places where our freedom was born become unholy, unfriendly, and neglected. May it be that our effort to perfect those principles and to continue to uphold and live just and holy principles is manifested in the beauty and order of those places where they were born. It is Constitution Day. Good night. God bless. Live free.